Another thing that frustrates me is that people don't really understand numbers. So they see a figure like 2.3 billion and think, oh gosh, that's an absolutely enormous number. Now, of course, for most companies it is, but not for a company the size of Tesco's. It's by far the UK's biggest single retailer. Its turnover, you can measure in different ways, but it's something close to 70 billion. So profits of 2.3 billion on turnover close to 70 billion is actually quite unremarkable.
Yeah, it almost made me think, I saw someone saying online that, well, I feel like this is great as a Tesco investor. And I'm like, do you really want to be a Tesco investor? Is that the company you want to put your money in? It doesn't seem like they're a particularly high margin entity. I mean, the average profit margin is probably something closer to 10% than it is to 4 or 5%. So I'd be happy as a supermarket for what Tesco is achieving, but I don't think I'd be happy as an investor when I had other options.
I mean, to be fair to Tesco's on another point, I mean, they have actually been increasing the wages of their workers at quite a decent clip. I mean, they've had to, of course, because there are labour shortages. But the workers, people who work at Tesco's, are benefiting from the success of the business, as well as the shareholders. But also, of course, the customers. That's the whole point. I mean, the reason why Tesco is successful is that it is such a major retailer that provides loads of goods and also some services at relatively affordable prices. So this is sort of market-led. People aren't forced to shop at Tesco's, but lots of them decide to do so.
There's a sense in which, though, Tesco and perhaps other supermarkets as well have been allowed or emboldened by the cost of living crisis to put up their prices, that the farmers will complain, although I don't know if this is entirely true. I'll say we're not seeing the big benefits that you see in retail prices going up, but the supermarket seems to have benefited anyway. And then the people perceive the price rises they see as the fault of the retailer, and then they see this profit margin, they get really angry at it. I'm wondering what you say to that.
Well, again, it's not clear to me what they are supposed to be angry about, because the profit margins are very small, as I said, about 4%. So if they're just looking at the headline numbers, then you need to put those in context. And as I say, those numbers are unremarkable for a company the size of Tesco's. If they were profiteering, then you'd expect those numbers to be at least twice as high as they actually are.
They'd be very poor at profiteering. I mean, the other point as well that's often missed is the sense that, Tesco is monopolizing or some kind of oligopoly, but there's so much competition in the sector. I mean, I compare it to people complain about in Australia a supermarket duopoly, because Coles and Woolworths, between the two of them in the Australian context, have something like 80% market share, which you could argue is quite substantial. Maybe they do have some market power, but applying that to the UK just seems ridiculous. I mean, Tesco is the biggest at 25%, and then from there, the next biggest is like 10-15% at Sainsbury's and Aldi, and then you have so many other smaller stores. You have corner shops, and you have the likes of Amazon also coming into the sector.
Well, the game changer for me is the ease of comparing prices between supermarkets. I mean, you've always been possible to do that, but it's so much easier now with the internet. So you can easily go online to find out whose prices are cheapest. On top of that, of course, you have the supermarkets themselves matching prices against each other. So in that environment, unless you can show any evidence at all of some sort of cartel cooperation going on behind the scenes, and there's no sign of that given how tight the profit margins are, then there seems to be an industry where complaining about profiteering is just dust.
I suppose there's a broader sense here in which profit is seen as something dirty, that it's kind of immoral for a company that is providing such an essential service would dare make a profit in the process, that the profit is immoral. I'm wondering what you make of that kind of argument, that, okay, you might be right, the profit margins are slim, but the profit margin's gone up, and any profit is too much.
Yeah, no, I do understand the optics of that. So when something is in short supply, and therefore the price of that good or service rises, then people may well feel that the provider of that good or service is taking advantage of that. And I do understand that at a human level. But as a piece of economics, it's pretty poor, because it's precisely that increase in price and the profit associated with it that you need to correct the imbalance between supply and demand that's caused the problem in the first place. So on the one hand, the fact that companies can sell their good or service at a higher price encourages them to produce more of it. But also it makes sure that those people who perhaps don't need that good or service as much as other people do decide to spend their money on something else instead. So the pricing mechanism is absolutely essential to balance supply and demand. And interfering with that pricing mechanism is a really bad idea. Now, it might be that you're worried about the impact of shortages on particular types of people, but the correct solution there is to subsidise their incomes rather than intervene and control prices. So you might top up the income of those who have smaller budgets to make sure they can continue to afford goods and services that are more expensive. But what you don't do is artificially manipulate prices downwards, because that discourages the right price responses, both on the supply side and the demand side.
Well, I mean, classically, price controls lead to, and there was some demands for them early on in the cost of living crisis. I mean, they do inevitably lead to shortages, because if you have to sell a good at below the cost of procuring that good, then you simply stop selling it. I mean,
and there's so many examples from the last few years. Just to give two, one is that there's some people suggesting that energy prices shouldn't have been allowed to rise at all during the fallout from Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that we should have kept prices very, very low, which would have been very damaging, because that wouldn't have encouraged people to save on energy where they can, and it wouldn't have provided the incentive for companies to provide more energy into the market. Another classic example, of course, is rent controls, which is a classic example of a bad idea that never ever seems to go away. And as far as I'm aware, every single example of rent controls has backfired in one way or another, including the recent experiments in Scotland, where the Scottish government has intervened to cap rents. It's backfired in terms of reducing the supply and quality of housing available, but also in some cases actually prompted landlords to raise rents by more than they otherwise have done, while they still can before the end of before a tenancy has to be renewed.
Yeah, and the Scottish system also had something about how you can't change the rental costs within the rental agreement, but you can change it between rental agreements, and actually you're just going to charge more to begin with.
Exactly.
For the risk of not being able to.
So landlords front load any increase in rent they might be thinking of doing to make sure that they can still make a decent profit.
They're not restricted from doing it. I mean, I think there's also the other important element here, which is profit is the reward for being able to provide a service or a product. It's the reward for the totality of what you're selling being better and more valuable to the consumer than the sum of its parts. I don't think that's particularly understood. It's what encourages the Tesco to exist. I mean, Tesco will say nice things about why they're cutting prices or how they're supporting food banks, but Tesco is a company and its purpose is to deliver a profit. And the reason why people invest in Tesco or put money into Tesco, perhaps not the best investment, as we said, but the reason why people are willing to put their capital into it and to build supermarkets and to create complex logistics systems and to find supply chains from around the world to deliver products and get them, to you at the right time in the right place. Quite an extraordinary achievement in itself, what Tesco is doing or what any supermarket is doing. But in order to motivate doing all that work, you have to have some level of return.